Welcome back to Cowboy Dusk, the channel where the dust never settles, where cowboys ride hard, love harder, and justice always finds its way home. If frontier courage and untamed love stories are what set your soul on fire, you're exactly where you belong. A wealthy rancher rides out one frozen morning and sees smoke rising from a cabin on his land. A cabin he wrote off as rubble 3 years ago. Someone is living there, without permission, without explanation. His first instinct is to drive them out. But when he kicks through that door, he finds a woman holding a rifle, standing over a freshly skinned wolf carcass. And she doesn't flinch. She doesn't apologize. She looks him dead in the eye and says, "That wolf you're tracking? I killed it 3 nights ago." What happens next will shake everything this man believes about power, control, and what it truly means to own something. Because the secret she's hiding in a dead man's letter doesn't just threaten his empire, it exposes a betrayal buried for 12 years beneath his own father's grave. Stay until the end. This one will hit you different. This story will remind you that real strength isn't about controlling everything around you. It's about having the courage to let someone in, and that starting over is never giving up. It is the bravest thing you'll ever do. If that sounds like a story worth hearing, hit subscribe and ring that bell so you never miss a ride. Drop a comment, share this with someone who needs it, and let's ride together. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.
The first shot Nathaniel Cross fired that morning was not aimed at the wolf circling his dead calves. It was aimed at the sky, a warning for whoever was living on his land without his knowledge or permission. The sound cracked across the Montana high country like a whip and died somewhere in the pines. Nathaniel lowered the Winchester and sat his horse on the frozen ridge, breath steaming in the pre-dawn dark, and studied the 3 dead calves lying in the snow below him. Their throats were torn open. Blood had frozen black against the white ground. Wolf tracks circled the kills in wide arcs, and the drag marks told him the pack had tried to haul one of the carcasses toward the tree line before giving up. 12 head this month. 12 head he could not afford to lose, not because the money hurt him, but because loss without explanation violated every principle he had built his life around. Nathaniel Cross was 34 years old, and he owned everything the eye could see from this ridge. 20,000 acres of grazing land, timber stands, and water rights stretching from the Yellowstone River to the shadow of the Absaroka Range. He employed 16 men year-round. He shipped beef to Chicago and Denver. He kept books so precise that a banker in Helena had once told him they were the cleanest records in the territory. He did not believe in luck. He believed in systems, and systems required information. The column of smoke rising from Hackberry Valley was information he did not have. He saw it as his horse picked its way along the ridge, following the wolf tracks south. Thin smoke. Controlled. Not a wildfire, not a brush burn. It rose from the chimney of the old Hackberry cabin, a structure he had last seen 3 winters ago when the roof was half collapsed and the windows were shattered by weather. He had written it off in his records as a total loss, useful only for salvage lumber if he ever needed it. But it was not the smoke that stopped him cold. It was the wolf carcass hanging from a pine branch near the cabin, skinned clean and stretched for curing with the kind of precision that spoke of experience, not desperation. Someone was not just living down there. Someone was defending the territory. Nathaniel reined his bay gelding to a halt and sat perfectly still, eyes narrowing against the gray light. The valley below was a difficult piece of land, accessible only through a narrow deer trail that wound through dense pine and over a rocky creek bed that flooded every spring. He had never bothered to fence it because cattle would not graze there and the timber was not worth hauling out. It was territory he owned but did not use. a blind spot in his otherwise meticulous operation. Now someone was exploiting that blind spot. His gaze drifted to the small stone marker beneath the lone pine on the ridge, his father's grave. He passed it every time he rode this trail. He never stopped. He never looked at it directly. He had not stood at that grave in 6 years, and he intended to keep it that way. Some things a man buried stayed buried. That was the only kind of faith Nathaniel Cross practiced. He urged the horse down the trail toward the valley floor. The details sharpened as he descended. The cabin roof had been patched with overlapping shakes. Amateur work, but competent. The shutters were rehung. A cord of split firewood stood stacked against the north wall beneath a lean-to made of salvaged planks. Snare lines ran along the creek in carefully spaced intervals. And the defensive perimeter around the cabin was not military, but it was deliberate. Whoever lived here understood what could kill them, and had planned accordingly. Nathaniel dismounted 20 yards out and looped his reins over a low branch. He approached on foot, his right hand resting on the colt at his hip, not drawn, but ready. He knocked once. The sound was flat in the cold air. From inside came the unmistakable metallic click of a rifle being cocked. Then the door opened. The woman standing in the doorway was maybe 28, thin but not gaunt. Dark hair pulled back in a working braid. She wore a canvas shirt and a wool skirt, both worn to softness but clean and carefully mended. And in her hands was a Winchester lever action rifle pointed at the ground, not aimed at him, but not put away either. She looked at him with eyes that were calm, measuring, and completely unsurprised. "You are Cross," she said. Not a question. "You are on my land," he said. "I know. That wolf you are tracking, I killed it 3 nights ago. It took 2 of my rabbits before I put it down. No apology, no justification, no tears. She stated facts the way a telegraph operator sends messages. Clean, efficient, stripped of anything unnecessary." Nathaniel studied her face. She studied his right back. Neither of them blinked. He walked the perimeter of the cabin without asking permission. She did not stop him. He examined the roof repair, noting the correct overlap of the shakes and the pine pitch sealant in the gaps. He checked the root cellar she had dug into the hillside, lined with stones and covered with a weighted door. Inside were potatoes, turnips, and clay jars that held what looked like berry preserves. The wolf pelt hanging from the branch was worth good money, skinned with a steady hand. But he also noticed what she was trying to hide. She was thinner than she ought to be. A cut on her left hand was showing the pink edges of early infection. Scorch marks on the cabin floor told him she had burned at least 1 piece of furniture for heat when the firewood ran low. She was surviving. But she was standing on the edge of a cliff, and the wind was picking up. "How long have you been here?" he asked when he came back around to the front. 6 weeks. And you did not think to ask permission. I did not think you would give it. She was right about that, and they both knew it. Nathaniel pulled his gloves off and tucked them in his belt. He looked at the cabin, the woodpile, the wolfskin, the woman with the rifle who watched him the way a hawk watches a snake, ready to move but unwilling to waste the energy until the threat was real. Something tightened in his chest. Not anger exactly. Something older and less welcome. A memory he kept locked in a room he never entered. A woman's face in a snowstorm, a door closing. A baby that never made it through its first winter because he had done exactly what he was supposed to do and followed the rules and sent a family into the cold without asking a single question about their circumstances. The Hargroves. He did not say their name. He never said their name. But their ghost stood between him and this woman as surely as the frozen ground beneath his boots. "I will be back tomorrow morning," Nathaniel said. "Do not go anywhere." He turned and walked to his horse, mounted, rode back up the ridge without looking behind him. But when he closed his eyes that night, lying in the dark of the big house he had built with his own hands, he did not see ledgers or fence lines. He saw a woman standing in a doorway with a rifle she clearly knew how to use, and eyes that expected nothing from him. It bothered him more than the wolves. Eliza Moore had learned one thing from 3 years on the frontier. Powerful men only came back for two reasons: to take something or to take someone. She checked the rounds in her Winchester for the third time before dawn, and set the rifle across her knees at the crate table and waited. She had not slept. She had spent the night replaying every word Nathaniel Cross had spoken, every gesture, every flicker of expression that crossed his face during their conversation. She was not afraid of him. She was afraid of miscalculating him. Miscalculation was what had cost her everything once before, and she had sworn on the grave of her unborn child that she would never be caught unprepared again. The memory came whether she wanted it or not. Not the cabin, not the cold, not the blood. The memory that came was the sound of hooves on frozen ground outside a different cabin in a different valley 2 years ago. Thomas's father and younger brother standing in the doorway with the deputy sheriff. The court order in the old man's hand, Eliza asking for one more day, just one, please, just let me pack properly, and being told no. Packing by lantern light. The deputy watching from the porch with his hand resting on his holster like she was a criminal instead of a widow. She had taken one trunk, $83, and her father's Winchester. The rifle was the only thing she swore she would never sell. Not if she was starving, not if she was freezing, not if the devil himself offered her paradise in exchange. Captain James Ward had put that rifle in her hands when she was 10 years old at Fort Ellis and taught her to shoot before she could write cursive. It was the last piece of her father she had left, and it had kept her alive through 2 Montana winters. Now, hoofbeats again. 2 horses this time, coming down the deer trail. Eliza stood and stepped outside with the Winchester visible but not raised. Her posture said what her mouth did not. I will go if I have to, but you will remember my face. Cross was not alone this time. He had brought a man with him. Tall, weathered, gray beard. Expression like somebody had carved it from sandstone and forgot to add any warmth. The man sat his horse and watched her with eyes that missed nothing. Eliza recognized the type immediately. Career lawman or military. The kind of man who cataloged details the way other people breathed. This is Jack Brennan, Nathaniel said, dismounting. My foreman. Mrs. Moore, Jack said, tipping his hat once. Mr. Brennan. Nathaniel set 3 items on the chopping block beside the door. A bag of coffee, a box of .44 caliber cartridges, and a single sheet of paper folded once. Eliza looked at the items but did not touch them. Coffee was comfort. Ammunition was survival. Paper was either a contract or an eviction notice. She waited for him to explain. Nathaniel nodded at the paper. That is a contract, not work for shelter. I need someone watching this valley. The wolves have been coming down from the high country all winter. I have lost 12 head in the last month, and I do not have a man to spare for daily patrols this far north. You are already here. You have already killed a wolf. I am proposing that you serve as the northern range watcher for Hackberry Valley. Eliza picked up the paper and read it carefully. Her eyes moved across every line. Kill wolves and predators. Report fence damage. Monitor the creek water level. Flag trespassers. In exchange, the cabin, weekly supplies delivered by ranch hand, and $5 a month in wages. She read it twice. Set it down. This is not charity, she said. No, this is not pity. I do not do pity, Mrs. Moore. I do business. The valley needs watching. You are here to watch it. That is the arrangement. Eliza picked up the pen he had brought, signed her name in clear, steady script. Jack Brennan watched her sign. He noticed the steadiness of her hand. He noticed how she sat with her back never touching the chair. Her weight always shifted forward, positioned to stand instantly if she needed to. He noticed how her eyes tracked the tree line behind the 2 men, even while she was reading the contract. This woman had lived in danger before, not just encountered it, lived in it. Jack filed that knowledge away and said nothing. After the 2 men rode back up the ridge, Eliza stood alone in front of the cabin. She held the Winchester loosely in her right hand. She raised it, sighted on a pine stump 50 yards out, and fired 3 rounds in quick succession. 3 holes appeared in the stump, close enough together that a silver dollar would have covered all of them. She nodded once, satisfied. Then she did something she had not done in weeks. She made coffee with the bag Cross had left, sat on the cabin step with the tin cup warming her hands, and drank it slowly. Not because she had nowhere to be, because for the first time since Bozeman, something that was not pure survival had entered her life. She did not have a word for what it was. She was not sure she wanted one. But there was something she had not told Cross or his foreman. The day she came to Hackberry Valley, she had not stumbled on this cabin by luck. She had come because someone in the town of Elk Crossing had pointed the way. A red-haired woman who ran the saloon and who spoke Thomas Moore's name like it still mattered to her. Eliza did not gamble. She had been guided here. And the reason why was a question she was not yet ready to answer. News that a woman was living alone on Cross land reached the town of Elk Crossing in 3 days. By day 4, Silas Drummond was sitting in the Copper Bell saloon with a smile that anyone who knew him understood was not good news for somebody. Nathaniel rode into town on a gray Tuesday for supplies. Elk Crossing was a settlement built on mud and optimism. One main street running between a general store and a livery stable with a post office, a blacksmith, a tiny whitewashed church, and the Copper Bell saloon arranged along it like teeth in an old jaw. The population hovered around 200 on a good day. Everybody knew everybody, and everybody was looking at Nathaniel Cross a little differently this morning. The storekeeper, a round man named Henderson, who had been selling flour and ammunition in Elk Crossing since before the territory was organized, weighed out Nathaniel's order with studied casualness. "Here you got a new tenant up in Hackberry, Nate. Woman, from what people say." Nathaniel counted out his coins. "She works for me, range watcher. Anything else you heard is gossip." Henderson shrugged. "Gossip is all we got for entertainment out here. You know how people talk." Nathaniel did know, and he did not care. He had spent 12 years building a reputation on 2 pillars, competence and silence, and he was not going to explain himself to people who did not sign his payroll. He was loading the supplies into his saddlebags outside the store when a voice reached him from the boardwalk. "Nathaniel, good to see you in town." Silas Drummond stepped out of the shadow of the general store awning like he had been waiting there, which he probably had. The man was 52 years old, the second largest landowner in the valley, and dressed like he was attending a governor's reception instead of standing on a muddy street in a frontier town. Pressed vest, gold watch chain, clean shave, boots that had never touched a stirrup in anger. His hands were soft, his smile was warm, and his eyes had all the genuine feeling of a rattlesnake watching a mouse. "I hear you have got someone watching Hackberry for you," Drummond said. "Smart thinking. That valley has potential you have not tapped yet." The line was casual, friendly even. But Hackberry Valley controlled a spring-fed creek that flowed south through Drummond's grazing land, and Drummond had been trying to buy water access from Nathaniel for 6 years running. Nathaniel had refused every time. The creek was too valuable. The water kept his own stock alive through dry summers and gave him leverage over neighboring operations that depended on the same watershed. Drummond knew this, and the fact that he mentioned the valley by name told Nathaniel that the old snake was still watching, still calculating, still looking for an angle. Then Drummond added something that landed differently. "Your father was a good man, Nathaniel. Shame he did not have the head for business." The words hit like a fist wrapped in silk. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. His hands went still on the saddlebag strap. For a moment the 2 men stood in the muddy street, and the air between them turned cold in a way that had nothing to do with February. "My father is not your concern," Nathaniel said quietly. "Of course not. Just paying respects." Drummond touched the brim of his hat. "Give my regards to your new employee." He walked away with the unhurried stride of a man who had all the time in the world and intended to use every second of it against you. Nathaniel watched him go and felt something he could not name settle behind his ribs like a stone. He stopped at the Copper Bell before leaving town. The saloon was warm and dim, smelling of tobacco smoke, spilled whiskey, and the particular human smell of too many unwashed bodies sharing too small a space. Behind the bar stood Cora Bellamy, the owner. Red-haired, sharp-tongued, somewhere around 35, though she would cut a man who asked. She ran the copper bell the way a general runs a campaign, with total authority and no tolerance for insubordination. Cora poured his whiskey without being asked and set it in front of him. "The woman in hackberry," she said, polishing a glass with a rag that had seen better decades. "She is capable." It was not a question, but Nathaniel answered anyway. "She killed a wolf and skinned it cleaner than most of my hands could manage." "Good." Cora set the glass down and looked at him with an expression that suggested she knew considerably more than she was willing to share. "She will need to be." Nathaniel waited for her to explain. She moved to the next customer without another word. He filed the exchange away in the part of his mind that tracked things he did not understand yet, but suspected would matter later. On the trail home, an hour outside town, Nathaniel pulled his horse up short. Fresh tracks on the ridge above Hackberry Valley. Not his, not any of his men's. Two horses, shod, moving along the ridgeline at a walk, stopping at three separate points that all had clear sight lines down into the valley. Someone had been up here watching the cabin, and the tracks led south toward Drummond's land, before disappearing on a shelf of exposed rock where hoofprints would not hold. Nathaniel sat his horse on the ridge and felt the stone behind his ribs grow heavier. He rode down into the valley to warn Eliza. She was splitting kindling outside the cabin, working with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice. She looked up when he dismounted, but did not stop working. "Someone has been watching you from the ridge," he said. "Fresh tracks. Two riders. Came from the south." Eliza set the axe aside and wiped her hands on her apron. "I know. I found boot prints by the creek 3 days ago. Somebody was watching the cabin from the tree line. I marked the tracks and followed them as far as the rock shelf before I lost them. You did not think to tell me. I handle threats to my position. You handle threats to your property. Those prints were at my door, not yours." The statement crackled between them like static before a lightning strike. She was drawing a line. My territory, your territory, professional, territorial, and underneath it, something neither of them was willing to name. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze without flinching. "Fair enough," he said finally. "But if those tracks come back, you tell me. That is not a request. I will consider it." She went back to her kindling. He went back to his horse. And as he rode up the ridge, he realized he had just had a negotiation with a woman who had no leverage at all and had somehow come away feeling like he had lost a point. That night, 2 gunshots echoed from Hackberry Valley, 3 seconds apart, sharp and deliberate in the winter darkness. Nathaniel grabbed his rifle and saddled his horse before the echoes died. The grizzly came when the moon was up, 400 pounds of starving muscle shaken awake too early by a false thaw and too hungry to fear fire. Eliza heard it before she saw it, a sound that did not belong to the night. Heavy breathing, wet and rasping, and then the crack of wood as something massive hit the door of her root cellar with the force of a freight wagon. She was out of bed and on her feet with the Winchester in her hands before her mind finished processing what her ears already knew. She took the lantern in her left hand, the rifle in her right, and opened the cabin door. The grizzly was tearing apart the root cellar. It had already ripped the salvaged door off its leather hinges and scattered the stones she had so carefully laid. In the yellow lantern light, she could see it clearly. A male, young but massive, ribs showing through matted fur. This bear had been starving. The warm spell had woken it weeks ahead of schedule, and it had come down from the high country looking for anything it could eat. It turned when the light hit its eyes, rose onto its hind legs. Standing upright, it was taller than the cabin door frame. Its mouth opened, and the roar that came out shook the glass in the windows and turned Eliza's blood to ice water. She fired. The first shot hit the shoulder. The bear staggered sideways, bellowed, and dropped to all fours. She fired again, but the bear was already charging, and the second round went wide, punching into a pine trunk behind the animal. Eliza threw herself backward through the cabin door and slammed it shut. The bar dropped into its brackets a half-second before 400 pounds of enraged grizzly hit the door like a battering ram. The wood cracked. The bar held, but barely. She could see the door bowing inward with each impact. Splinters flew. The bear roared again so close that she could smell it through the gaps in the wood. Rotten meat and wet fur and the hot copper stink of its own blood from the shoulder wound. Eliza shoved the table against the door, grabbed the chair, and climbed. She had left a gap in the cabin ceiling months ago, an access point to the roof for chimney repairs. She had never imagined using it like this. She pulled herself up through the narrow opening, scraping her forearm raw on the rough-hewn beams, and emerged onto the roof of the cabin just as the bear hit the door again hard enough to crack the bar clean through. From the rooftop, she had a downward angle through the smoke hole in the center of the roof. She chambered another round, steadied her breathing the way her father had taught her, the way Captain James Ward had drilled into a 10-year-old girl at Fort Ellis a lifetime ago. Slow in, slow out. Squeeze, do not pull. The third shot hit the bear in the neck. It staggered, roared, stumbled away from the cabin door, but it did not go down. It circled, blood running black down its chest, head swinging, trying to find the source of the pain. Eliza chambered the last round in the magazine. Fired. The shot went through the bear's ear and into the pine wall of the cabin. A miss. The Winchester was empty. She was on the roof of a cabin in the middle of the Montana wilderness at 2 a.m. with an empty rifle and a wounded grizzly circling below her. She picked up the hatchet she had left on the roof for splitting shingles and gripped it in both hands. "Come on, then," she whispered to the bear. "Come on." That was when she heard the hoofbeats, coming fast down the deer trail, and then a voice, sharp and commanding in the darkness. "Eliza, where are you?" Nathaniel Cross rode into the clearing at a dead run, his bay gelding sliding on the frozen ground. He took in the scene in a single sweep. The broken root cellar, the smashed cabin door, the wounded grizzly circling with its head low and blood pouring from its neck and shoulder. And on the roof, silhouetted against the stars, Eliza Moore standing with a hatchet in her hands, ready to fight a grizzly bear with nothing but a hand axe because she had nothing else left. The image burned into his brain and would not leave for the rest of his life. He dismounted while the horse was still moving, hit the ground at a run, chambered a round in his Winchester and fired from 10 yards. The bullet entered the grizzly's skull behind the left ear, and the animal dropped like a mountain falling. It hit the frozen ground with a sound that Eliza would hear in her nightmares for months. Silence. Then the gelding snorting nervously. The creek murmuring. The sound of Nathaniel's breathing, hard and fast from the ride. Eliza climbed down from the roof. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear, not exactly. The fear would come later. Right now, it was the cold and the adrenaline crash, the sudden absence of danger leaving a vacuum that her body did not know how to fill. Her forearm was bleeding freely from the rough beams, and blood had soaked through her sleeve to the elbow. Nathaniel reached for her arm without thinking, pure instinct, checking the wound the way he would check any injury on any person or animal on his ranch. His fingers closed around her wrist, and he turned her arm toward the lantern light that spilled from the cabin's broken doorway. Both of them froze. The contact was electric, his hand on her skin, her pulse hammering beneath his fingertips. For a long moment, neither of them moved, and the night held its breath around them. Eliza pulled her arm away. "I need a bandage," she said. "Not a keeper." "I know, but you also need more ammunition." She almost smiled at that. Almost. The ghost of it flickered at the corner of her mouth and was gone. The cabin door was destroyed. The bar was cracked in half and the hinges were twisted beyond repair. There was no way to secure the building against anything larger than a rabbit. Nathaniel looked at the sky, looked at the dead bear, looked at the 4 miles of dark trail between here and the ranch house. "I am staying," he said. It was not a suggestion. Eliza considered arguing, decided against it. She was too tired, too cold, and too honest with herself to pretend she did not want someone between her and the darkness tonight. She went inside and bandaged her arm with strips torn from an old shirt. Nathaniel sat down outside the broken door, his back against the frame, rifle across his knees. A closed door would have been between them if the door still existed. Instead, there was just the cold air and the dead bear and the slowly fading lantern light. For a long time, silence. Nathaniel thought she had fallen asleep. Then he heard it through the thin cabin walls, breathing that was not steady. The kind of trembling that comes when a person who has held themselves together through a crisis finally lets the adrenaline go and discovers what is waiting underneath. Not crying exactly, something quieter. The private collapse of someone who has survived one more thing and is not sure how many more they can absorb. Nathaniel did not stand up, did not go inside, did not ask if she was all right. He sat with his back against the doorframe and let her hear his weight there, steady, unmoving, present, not intruding, just existing on the other side of the wall. After a long time, the trembling stopped. Neither of them mentioned it. Just before dawn, when the cold was at its deepest and the stars were fading, Eliza spoke from inside the cabin. Her voice was rough and quiet. "My father was an army surgeon. He taught me to shoot before I learned to write cursive." "That explains the marksmanship. What is your excuse?" "Army scout. 2 years on the frontier." "Then you know what it is like. Sitting up all night listening to the dark." "I do. Does it get easier?" "No, you just get used to it not getting easier. Short sentences. Halting. Two people talking through a broken doorway in the last hour before sunrise. Intimate without touch. Vulnerable without confession. The kind of conversation that only happens when the walls are too thin to hide behind and too late at night to keep pretending. In the morning, they skinned the grizzly together in silence. The work was bloody, methodical, and strangely companionable. They moved around each other with an ease that surprised them both, passing the skinning knife back and forth without having to ask, anticipating each other's movements as naturally as two people who had been working together for years instead of hours. When they finished and Nathaniel was strapping the hide to his saddle, he stopped and looked at Eliza. She was cleaning the knife on a patch of snow, her face composed, her hands steady again. The morning light was gray and cold, and it caught the line of her jaw and the dark braid falling across her shoulder, and the absolute stubborn determination in her eyes. He realized this was the first night he had spent on his own land, where he had not felt alone. The feeling was more dangerous than any bear. 3 weeks after the grizzly, Eliza Moore had become the most dangerous thing on the Cross Ranch. Not because she could cause harm, but because she made 16 men and their boss reconsider everything they thought they knew about how things ought to be. A late winter ice storm tore down a quarter-mile of east fence on a Tuesday night. The wind came screaming off the mountains with sleet mixed in, coating everything in a shell of ice that snapped branches and brought down fence posts like matchsticks. By dawn Wednesday, Nathaniel had every hand on the ranch mobilized for emergency repairs. Cattle were drifting. 2 sections of wire were down completely, and the equipment shed was so far behind on maintenance that half the tools his men needed were broken, dull, or missing. He sent Tommy Redfield to Hackberry Valley with a message. "Get Mrs. Moore. Bring her to the main ranch. Equipment repair." Tommy returned 2 hours later with Eliza riding behind him on one of the ranch's spare horses. She walked into the bunkhouse compound carrying her tools in a canvas roll, the Winchester slung over her shoulder out of habit, and stopped at the workshop door to survey 3 months of deferred maintenance piled on every available surface. Broken harnesses, cracked axe handles, rusted hinges, frayed rope, a barrel of damaged tack that nobody had touched since November. She did not flinch. She did not complain. She set down her tools, rolled up her sleeves, and went to work. The ranch hands watched her the way men on the frontier watched anything new and potentially threatening, with a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and the particular wariness of people whose routines had just been disrupted. Most of them said nothing. A few muttered to each other. One of them said something loud enough for everyone to hear. "We taking orders from a woman now." That was Dale Sutter, 45 years old, good with cattle, bad with change. He had been working ranches since he was 14, and he had never once taken instruction from anyone who wore a skirt. Eliza did not look at him, did not respond. Instead, she reached across the workbench and picked up the broken bridle cheek strap that Dale had been wrestling with all morning without success. She examined the brake, found the leather punch and wax thread on her own, and repaired the strap in 8 minutes flat using a frontier knot technique that none of the men had ever seen. She handed it back to Dale without a word. He tested it, pulled hard on both ends, twisted it. The repair held solid. Dale said nothing. But he stopped talking about taking orders from a woman. Tommy Redfield was the first one to ask Eliza to teach him the knot. Within the hour, 3 other hands had gathered around the workbench watching her demonstrate while they tried to copy her technique. She taught the way her father had taught her, with patience and precision, and no tolerance for laziness. She corrected their hand positions without criticism. She expected them to pay attention and try again when they failed. And they did. That evening, with the ice storm still howling outside, disaster struck again. A horse in the stable spooked at a crack of thunder and snapped its tie line clean. The animal bolted through the stable doors into the frozen yard, trailing 20 feet of rope behind it. Tommy, who was closest, grabbed for the trailing line and got his arm tangled in the loops. The horse dragged him 15 feet across the ice before the boy managed to get his legs under him. And by then the rope had twisted around his right arm so tightly that when the horse hit the end of its run against the yard fence, the sudden stop dislocated Tommy's shoulder with a sound like a green branch snapping. Tommy screamed and went down. Eliza was across the yard before any of the men had finished processing what had happened. She cut the rope with her belt knife, dropped beside Tommy, and put one hand on his chest to hold him still. "Look at me," she said. Her voice was calm and absolute. "Look at my eyes. Breathe in. Slow. Hold it." Tommy was gasping, tears running down his face, his right arm hanging at an angle that made several of the watching hands look away. Eliza braced his body with her knee, gripped his arm above the elbow and below the shoulder, and in one smooth, practiced motion that spoke of training by an army field surgeon, she reset the joint. Tommy screamed again, then gasped, then stared at her with an expression caught somewhere between awe and terror. "Do not move that arm for 2 days," Eliza said. "Cold water compress if it swells. If the pain gets worse, come find me." "Yes, Ma-am," Tommy whispered. The Ma-am was genuine. First time any hand on the ranch had used it without irony. Nathaniel arrived at the workshop an hour later. He had been out with Jack checking the fallen fence line and had not seen any of it. He walked through the door and stopped. Eliza was showing 2 of the younger hands how to splice rope. Her sleeves were rolled up past the elbows. Firelight from the forge played across her face, catching the line of her jaw, the concentration in her eyes, the steady certainty of her hands as she demonstrated the technique. She was focused, patient, completely absorbed in the work. She belonged in this space as naturally as the tools on the wall. Nathaniel stood in the doorway and watched, not evaluating her work, looking at her. The moment stretched. The firelight flickered. The wind howled outside. And something shifted in his chest that he was not prepared for and did not know how to name. Jack appeared at his shoulder, cleared his throat. Nathaniel walked in as if he had just arrived. Neither man mentioned it. Both knew. The storm kept everyone on the ranch overnight. Eliza was given the small guest room at the end of the bunkhouse, a closet-sized space usually used for storing extra blankets. Through the thin wall that separated her from the main bunkhouse, she could hear the hands talking. "Cross is sweet on her," Dale Sutter said. "Give it 3 months. We will all be answering to the missus." Laughter. The low rumble of men amusing themselves at their employer's expense. Eliza lay in the dark with her hands clenched at her sides, not angry, afraid. She knew how this worked. She had seen it destroy women before. If the rumor solidified, she would lose the only thing protecting her on this ranch. The respect she had earned through competence. It would be replaced by something else entirely. Suspicion. Resentment. The assumption that whatever she accomplished was not earned but given, payment for warming the boss's bed. She could not let that happen. Not again. Not ever. Before dawn, she slipped out of the bunkhouse to leave. But Jack Brennan was already awake, sitting on the bunkhouse porch with a cigarette burning between his fingers and a cup of coffee that steamed in the gray pre-dawn cold. He had been waiting. "Cora Bellamy told you about Hackberry," he said. It was not a question. Eliza went still. "I make it my business to know things," Jack said. "Cora and I go back a ways. She mentioned she pointed someone toward the North Valley last fall, and I want to know why. Cora does not do charity any more than Nate does. If she sent you here, she had a reason." Eliza considered lying. She had become very good at it over the past 2 years. But there was something about Jack Brennan's face, the worn honesty of it, the patient watchfulness, that made lying feel like more effort than it was worth. "Thomas Moore was her friend," Eliza said. "She knows what happened to me in Bozeman. She said Cross's Land was the one place safe from certain people." "What people?" Eliza shook her head. "Not ready, not yet. Ask me again when I trust you enough to answer." She walked out into the dawn without looking back. Jack watched her go, finished his cigarette, ground it out under his boot heel, and said to nobody in particular, "That woman is running from something with teeth." Eliza reached the Hackberry cabin 2 hours later, frozen and exhausted from the 4-mile walk through ice-crusted snow. She pushed open the cabin door and stepped inside. Everything looked the same. The bed, the shelves, the fire banked and cold in the hearth. But something was wrong. She felt it before she saw it. A wrongness in the air, a displacement. Something moved that should not have been. Her trunk, the one she had carried from Bozeman, the one that held Thomas's last letter beneath the false bottom. It had been moved, not much, 2 inches to the left. But Eliza Moore knew the position of every object in this cabin the way a card player knows the position of every card in the deck, and the trunk had been shifted. Someone had been inside her cabin while she was gone. Someone had been looking for something. They had not found it. The letter was in her coat pocket, where it always was, where it had been since the day she found it in Thomas's jacket after the funeral. An envelope she had never opened, the last words of a dead man that she had been too afraid to read for 2 years. But whoever had searched the cabin would come back. She was certain of that. Eliza pulled the trunk to its proper position, built up the fire, sat in the chair with the Winchester across her knees and the unopened letter pressing against her heart through the layers of wool and canvas. She was not safe here. She had never been safe. And the question of who had sent someone to search her cabin was a question she was very much afraid she already knew the answer to. The fence had been cut, not by weather, not by wildlife, by bolt cutters. 3 clean sections right where 200 head of winter stock were grazing, and beyond the gap, hoofprints leading straight toward Drummond land. Nathaniel found the damage on a Thursday morning during his regular fence check. He dismounted and examined the cuts with his bare hands, feeling the smooth, sheared edges of the wire. No rust on the cut surfaces. Fresh. Done within the last 48 hours. And done with the kind of precision that said whoever wielded the cutters knew exactly what they were doing. He followed the cattle tracks east for 3 miles until they crossed onto Drummond Range. Then he kept riding until he reached the Drummond headquarters, a sprawling operation with a stone main house and 4 outbuildings that made Nathaniel's ranch look like a homesteader's claim. Drummond received him in the front parlor like a visiting dignitary. Coffee was offered. Chairs were provided. Pleasantries were exchanged with the oiled smoothness of a man who had been deflecting confrontation his entire life. "We found 47 of your head on our south range this morning," Drummond said. "My boys have already started pushing them back toward your fence line. I am sure you will want to collect them." "I will." "All 47? Drummond spread his hands in a gesture of helpless generosity. "Well, we recovered 36 for certain. The other 11 might have scattered. Open range out there, Nathaniel. They could be anywhere. I am sure they will turn up." 11 head. Roughly $400 worth of cattle. Not enough to justify a legal battle or an armed confrontation. Just enough to hurt. Just enough to send a message. The smile on Drummond's face told Nathaniel everything the man's words did not. He knew exactly where those 11 head were. And he knew that Nathaniel knew. And he did not care because the game was not about 11 cattle. The game was about pressure. Slow, steady, carefully calibrated pressure, applied over time, wearing down the opposition the way water wears down stone. "Thank you for your hospitality," Nathaniel said. He set down his coffee untouched and walked out. Back at the ranch, Jack Brennan was already examining the cut fence when Nathaniel arrived. "This is not the first time," Jack said. He held up a section of the severed wire. "Those 3 head we lost during the fall drive, same kind of cut, clean, professional, and always right where the cattle are clustered thickest." He dropped the wire and looked at Nathaniel with an expression that was both grim and certain. "Somebody has been bleeding you slow, Nate. Not enough to start a war, just enough to make you a little weaker every season, and I am betting it has been going on longer than either of us realized." Nathaniel stared at the cut wire in Jack's hands and felt the pieces clicking together in his mind like the tumblers of a lock. The missing cattle, the boundary disputes, the offers to buy his water rights that came every spring with the regularity of snowmelt. Drummond had been running a campaign against him for years, so patient and so gradual that Nathaniel had written off each incident as bad luck or normal frontier loss. It was not luck. It was strategy. And Nathaniel had been too proud of his own systems to see the system being used against him. He rode down to Hackberry Valley that afternoon. Eliza was mending a snare line along the creek, her hands quick and practiced in the cold. She looked up when he dismounted and read his expression the way she read weather, quickly and without illusion. "What happened?" she said. Nathaniel told her. The cut fence, the missing cattle, the pattern Jack had identified. She listened without interruption, her eyes narrowing as the picture formed. "You have got enemies, Cross," she said when he finished. "I have got competitors." Not that different. On the frontier, a competitor is just an enemy who has not found his reason yet. It was the most honest assessment anyone had given him, and the bluntness of it cut through 12 years of careful self-deception. Nathaniel sat on a fallen log and told her about Drummond for the first time. Not because he trusted her, because she was living on the front line of his territory, and she needed tactical information to stay alive. He told her about the water rights dispute, about the years of low-grade aggression, about the political connections Drummond maintained in Bozeman and beyond. He told her about the justice of the peace in Elk Crossing, who owed Drummond money and had never once ruled against him in a property dispute. Eliza listened to everything. Then she asked a question that hit him like a rifle shot. "Was Drummond connected to your father at all?" Nathaniel frowned. "My father died when I was 22. Drummond was just a neighbor back then." "Why?" Eliza shook her head slightly. "No reason. Just thinking." But her expression told him she had filed something away, a connection she sensed but could not yet prove. And the question sat in the back of his mind like a burr under a saddle, small and sharp and impossible to ignore. Later that afternoon, while Eliza was working in the equipment shed at the main ranch, Jack found her alone. He had been watching the dynamic between her and Nathaniel for weeks now, and he had decided she needed a piece of information that might change how she saw the man she was working for. "You think he kept you around because you are handy with a bridle," Jack said, leaning against the doorframe. "And you are, but that is not the whole reason." Eliza set down the harness she was working on. "I am listening. 2 winters ago, Nate evicted a family from the south pasture. Squatters. Name of Hargrove. Standard procedure. 3 days to vacate. He did not ask questions. Did not check circumstances." Jack paused. His weathered face was carefully neutral, but his eyes were not. The wife was 7 months pregnant. They left in a January blizzard. That spring, word came back that the baby died, born premature in a canvas tent outside Livingston. The silence in the equipment shed was absolute. "Nate does not talk about it," Jack continued, "but he rides past that south pasture where they camped, and he always looks, every single time. He is not a cruel man, But he made a choice without asking questions, and a child paid for it. Eliza absorbed this the way dry ground absorbs rain. Slowly, completely, changing shape beneath the surface while the surface itself remained still. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because you are building walls against a man who is already punishing himself harder than you ever could. Seemed like you should know what is on the other side of those walls." Jack straightened up, touched the brim of his hat, and left without waiting for a response. Eliza sat in the equipment shed for a long time after he was gone, her hands motionless on the leather she had been mending, seeing Nathaniel Cross in a new and complicated light. Not the untouchable rancher who controlled everything, not the cold pragmatist who made decisions by the numbers. A man carrying guilt he could not discharge. A man who had done the practical thing, the correct thing by every measure of frontier law, and it had broken something inside him that he did not know how to fix. She understood that kind of break. She carried one just like it. That night, alone in the cabin, Eliza sat on the edge of the bed and pulled the trunk from underneath. She opened the false bottom and touched the envelope she had been carrying for 2 years, Thomas's handwriting on the front. Her name. Just her name. Nothing else. The cabin had been searched. Someone knew the letter existed. She could not afford to wait any longer. But her hands would not stop shaking long enough to break the seal. Thomas Moore had been dead for 2 years, but tonight, in ink on yellowed paper, he was about to tell his wife the secret he did not live long enough to speak aloud. Eliza broke the seal at midnight. The fire was burning low, and the cabin was cold enough that she could see her breath. But she did not notice. Her attention had collapsed to the size of the page in her hands. Thomas's handwriting. Familiar as her own heartbeat, the slight leftward lean of his letters. The way he crossed his T's with a long, decisive stroke. The ink was faded but legible, and as she read, the words reached across 2 years of silence and grief, and changed everything she thought she knew. The letter was partially damaged. Water stains and mildew had blurred several sections where the paper had been folded against the lining of the trunk. But what remained clear was enough to detonate her entire understanding of what had happened in Bozeman. Thomas had discovered that someone was buying up debts from small farmers throughout the region, systematically, quietly, using intermediaries and lawyers to obscure the buyer's identity. The letters she could read of the buyer's name were clear enough. D-R-U. Then water damage. The rest was gone. Thomas had figured out that this person wanted his 40 acres specifically, because the land sat on a water corridor essential for large-scale cattle transport from the southern ranges to the railroad at Livingston. Thomas had hired Marcus Haywood, the Bozeman lawyer, to file a deed transfer that would put Eliza's name on the property. He had paid Haywood in advance. He had trusted him completely. "If you are reading this and I am not there," Thomas had written, "find Haywood. I have arranged everything. The land is yours legally and completely. He has the documents." Eliza read the line 3 times. Each time it hit differently. Thomas had tried to protect her. He had seen the danger coming, and he had taken steps to ensure she would be safe. And Haywood had taken his money, taken his trust, and betrayed both. The final section of the letter was the most damaged. Mildew had eaten through the paper in patches, leaving fragments. A name she could not read. A warning. And 3 partial words that she could only partially decipher. Do not trust. And further down, in Thomas's careful hand, the phrase knew about father, and then nothing. The rest was gone. Do not trust who? Knew about whose father? The damaged portions held the key to everything, and the key was locked behind water stains and mildew and the cruelty of time. Eliza read the letter 3 times, folded it carefully, placed it on the table. Then she stood up, walked outside into the February night and stood in the snow. The cold hit her like a wall. She stood in it without moving, arms at her sides, face turned up to the black sky and the sharp stars and the bitter wind coming off the mountains. She stood there until the cold replaced everything else. Until the rage and the grief and the nauseating sense of betrayal were buried under the numbing weight of a Montana winter pressing against her skin. A memory came, unbidden, unwelcome, the one she kept locked in the deepest part of herself. December 2 years ago. The cabin on Thomas's land. The cramping that started in the middle of the night and would not stop. Blood on the wooden floor she had scrubbed that morning. The hours of pain that followed, alone in the cold, with nobody to help and nobody to call. The silence after. The walk to the apple tree Thomas had planted there first spring. The bundle in her arms so small it barely weighed anything. She had tried to pray and could not remember the words. She had tried to cry and had run out of tears sometime around dawn. So she had simply stood there, holding the bundle against her chest, and whispered the only words that came. "I am sorry. I am sorry. I am sorry." She had buried the child she never got to know beneath that tree and walked back into the cabin and survived, because that was what she did. She survived. It was the only skill that had never failed her. Now she stood in different snow, outside a different cabin, holding a different grief. But the shape of it was the same. Loss upon loss, betrayal upon betrayal, and underneath it all the bedrock certainty that the world was not indifferent. It was actively hostile to people who had the audacity to build something beautiful and expect it to last. She survived that. She would survive this. In the morning, Eliza walked to the main house. She did not wait for an invitation. She did not send word ahead. She walked 4 miles through the snow and the early light, and arrived at Nathaniel's kitchen door with Thomas's letter in her hand and a look in her eyes that stopped him mid-sentence when he opened the door. "You need to read this," she said. "Drummond is not just after your land. He took mine first." She placed the letter on his desk and stood back. Nathaniel sat down and read it in silence. The only sound in the room was the ticking of the mantel clock and the slow creak of the house settling against the cold. When he finished, he looked up at her. "Why did you not tell me sooner?" "Because I did not know. Because I was too afraid to open my dead husband's last letter. Because sometimes surviving means not looking back." For the first time since he had met her, Nathaniel saw Eliza Moore without her armor. Not the controlled, strategic composure she wore like chainmail. Not the professional competence that kept the world at arm's length. This was raw, exhausted grief. The real person underneath the performance of strength. And what he saw was not weakness. It was the kind of terrible endurance that comes from carrying an impossible weight for so long that you have forgotten what it feels like to set it down. "The name in the damaged section," he said quietly. "You think it is Drummond. The letters DRU are clear. The rest is water damage. We need to recover that text. There is a printer in Livingston who does document restoration. Inks, papers, that kind of work. He might be able to bring out what the water destroyed. And if it confirms what I think, then Drummond did not just steal your land. He orchestrated the entire thing. And Haywood was not negligent. He was following orders." Eliza met his eyes. For a moment, the distance between them collapsed. Not employer and employee. Not rancher and range watcher. Two people looking at each other across the wreckage of everything they had lost, and recognizing the same damage. "Cora Bellamy told me to come here," Eliza said. "She said your land was the one place safe from Drummond. Now I understand why. He controls Bozeman. He controls the local law. But he does not control you." "Not yet," Nathaniel said. "And not ever." The words landed between them like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples in every direction. And in the early morning light, with a dead man's letter on the desk between them, Nathaniel Cross and Eliza Moore looked at each other and understood for the first time that they were in the same war. And the war had just begun. Nathaniel Cross had built his empire on one principle: never strike first. But that morning, when he buckled on his colt and swung into the saddle, he knew the principle had just died. The planning happened the night before around the kitchen table in the main house. 3 people, 3 minds, 3 different angles of attack. Jack Brennan laid out the tactical situation with the bluntness of a former Texas Ranger who had spent 20 years learning the difference between fights you could win and fights that would kill you. "We cannot go at Drummond with guns," he said. "The man has 3 hired men on permanent payroll, and he owns the justice of the peace in Elk Crossing. We ride onto his land with firearms and hostile intent. We are the ones who end up in the county jail, assuming we survive the ride." Eliza spread Thomas's letter on the table beside the ranch records Nathaniel had pulled from his office. She traced the connections with her finger as she spoke. Thomas's letter proves Haywood was given explicit instructions to file a deed transfer. The fact that Haywood never filed it, combined with the case records from the Bozeman court, constitutes evidence of deliberate sabotage. If we combine that with Nathaniel's cattle theft records and the documented fence cutting, we have enough to take the case over the local courts entirely. We go to Helena, the Territorial Land Commission. They have jurisdiction above any county judge Drummond has bought. Nathaniel listened to both of them. Then he laid out the resources. "I have the money to hire a Helena lawyer. I have the reputation to get an audience with the commission. Drummond is powerful in Bozeman and Elk Crossing, but he's been very careful to keep his operations below the level that would attract territorial attention. He's a big fish in a small pond. We need to put him in a bigger pond." The plan came together with the precision of 3 people who were accustomed to solving problems under pressure. Nathaniel would ride to Bozeman to confront Haywood and recover the original deed transfer documents from Thomas's case file. Eliza would take the damaged letter to the printer in Livingston for text recovery. Jack would stay at the ranch with the men, guarding against retaliation. Nathaniel left before dawn. The ride to Bozeman was 60 miles east, a full day on horseback through country that was just beginning to show the first signs of spring thaw. Snow receding from the south-facing slopes, creeks running louder, the air smelling of wet earth instead of ice, Montana exhaling after holding its breath all winter. The law office of Marcus Haywood occupied a narrow building on Main Street in Bozeman, wedged between the assayer's office and a dry goods store. The sign outside was professionally painted. The windows were clean. Everything about it projected competence and trustworthiness, which was exactly the point. Nathaniel tied his horse and walked in without knocking. The clerk, a thin young man with ink-stained fingers, looked up with practiced politeness. "How may I help you, sir? May I help you?" "I am here to see Mr. Haywood. I have a property matter. Do you have an appointment?" "No, Mr. Haywood is with a client currently. If you could return, I will wait." Something in Nathaniel's tone ended the conversation. The clerk gestured to a chair. Nathaniel remained standing. 20 minutes later, the private office door opened. A middle-aged woman emerged, clutching a handkerchief, her face streaked with tears. Haywood followed her out with an expression of practiced sympathy that made Nathaniel's skin crawl. "Mrs. Patterson, please do not worry. I will file the paperwork this week. We will have this resolved shortly." The woman paid the clerk a fee that visibly pained her and left. Haywood watched her go, then turned to Nathaniel. "I apologize for the wait. Mr. Cross." Nathaniel Cross. The name registered. Nathaniel watched it happen. A flicker of recognition followed by calculation, followed by the careful rearrangement of Haywood's features into professional welcome. The man's eyes changed, but his smile did not. "Please come in, Mr. Cross. How can I assist you today?" Nathaniel entered the office and sat in the client chair. Haywood settled behind his desk with the comfort of a man accustomed to controlling conversations from the other side of polished wood. "I understand you handled the estate case for Thomas Moore," Nathaniel said. "Property dispute outside Bozeman. His widow Eliza Moore was your client." Haywood's smile held, but something shifted behind it. "That case is concluded, Mr. Cross. I am not at liberty to discuss the details of previous client matters. Confidentiality, you understand." "I understand completely. Let me be more specific. Thomas Moore paid you to file a deed transfer naming his wife as co-owner of his property. You never filed it. The deadline passed. His family's claim superseded hers, and she lost everything. The smile was gone now. Haywood's face had gone the color of old candle wax. That is a very serious accusation. It is not an accusation. It is a summary of facts that I have documented evidence to support, including a letter in Thomas Moore's own handwriting describing exactly what he paid you to do and exactly what you failed to do. Haywood stood. I think this conversation is over, Mr. Cross. Sit down. The two words filled the office like smoke. Haywood sat. Nathaniel leaned forward. I do not care about your reputation. I do not care about your practice. What I care about is the original case file for Eliza Moore, including whatever deed transfer documents Thomas Moore entrusted to you. You are going to give me copies of everything in that file, and you are going to tell me who instructed you to lose her case. Haywood's composure cracked. Not all the way, but enough to show the fear underneath. You do not understand what you are pushing at, Cross. Drummond has people everywhere. I am not the problem. I am just the man who signs the papers. Then give me the papers and I will deal with the man giving the orders. Haywood stared at him. The calculation happening behind his eyes was visible and ugly. Self-preservation wrestling with fear. The certainty that cooperation would bring consequences from Drummond fighting against the growing certainty that Nathaniel Cross was not going to leave without what he came for. He will know, Haywood said finally. The moment you walk out of here with those files, he will know. And he will not come after you. You are too rich, too connected. He will come after her. The words landed in Nathaniel's chest like a cold blade, but he did not let it show. That is my concern, not yours. The files. Haywood opened a cabinet with hands that trembled visibly. He pulled a folder, made copies at his desk using carbon paper, and handed the stack to Nathaniel without meeting his eyes. For what it is worth, Haywood said quietly, the woman deserved better. She had a legitimate claim. Thomas did everything right. I was the one who... He stopped, could not finish the sentence. Nathaniel did not help him. He took the files and left. The ride back from Bozeman cut through Pine Creek Canyon, a narrow passage with high rock walls on both sides, and a trail barely wide enough for 2 horses abreast. Nathaniel had ridden it 100 times without incident. This time was different. 3 riders were blocking the trail. They sat their horses in a line across the canyon's narrowest point. Bandanas pulled up over their faces, guns holstered but visible. The lead rider was broad-shouldered and sat his horse with the easy confidence of a man comfortable with violence. The second rider leaned slightly to the left in his saddle, an old injury compensating, a detail Nathaniel filed away automatically. The third rider was younger, thinner, and his bandana had slipped enough to show a jaw that was sharp and angular in a way that tugged at something in Nathaniel's memory without connecting. Mr. Drummond sends his regards, the lead rider said, says to remind you that a man's business is his own. The road home can get longer for people who forget that. Not an attack, a performance. Theater designed to intimidate. Nathaniel counted. 3 men, narrow canyon, no cover. The files from Haywood's office were in his saddlebag. If he fought and lost, the evidence went with him. If he fought and won, he would be the one facing charges for killing 3 men on a public trail. He backed his horse slowly, held eye contact with the lead rider until the canyon widened enough to turn. Then he spurred the gelding and rode hard for the open ground, the sound of laughter echoing off the canyon walls behind him. He reached the ranch after dark. Eliza was waiting on the porch of the main house, which told him she had already sensed something was wrong. She read his face the way she read everything, quickly and without comfort. He told them, the files from Haywood, the riders in the canyon, the threat. Eliza's composure broke. When the grizzly had pushed her to the edge and she had held, this was different. This was fury and fear tangled together so tightly that they came out as something neither of them expected. You went alone? Without telling anyone? That is exactly the kind of arrogance that... She stopped. The unfinished sentence hung in the air between them, vibrating with everything she could not say. The kind of arrogance I hate in people I care about. Nathaniel heard the words she did not speak. They hit harder than anything she could have said out loud. Then Eliza did something that neither of them anticipated. She stepped forward and grabbed his wrist. Not tenderly, the way a field medic checks a pulse. Clinical. Automatic. She pressed 2 fingers against the inside of his wrist and counted. Her breathing was unsteady. Her eyes were locked on his pulse point, not his face. She held on far longer than necessary, then released his wrist and stepped back. "You are fine," she said. "I know. Do not do that again." Meanwhile, the printer in Livingston had worked on Thomas's damaged letter with chemicals and magnification, and the particular patience of a man who spent his life coaxing secrets out of old paper. The results came back that same day, delivered by a courier Eliza had paid from her own wages. The name in the damaged section was now fully legible. Drummond. And the warning Thomas had written, the part eaten by mildew and water, read in its recovered form. "Do not trust Haywood. He is Drummond's man. He knew about Father Cross." 3 words. Father Cross. 2 words that connected Thomas Moore's murder of a livelihood to something much older and much darker. Thomas had known something about Drummond's connection to Nathaniel's father. The dead man's letter reached across 2 graves to join 2 families' tragedies together. Eliza did not understand the significance. She brought the recovered text to Nathaniel that evening and watched his face as he read it. He read those 3 words, "Knew about Father Cross," and the color drained from his face like water running out of a broken cup. "What does that mean?" Eliza asked. "I do not know," Nathaniel said. But he was lying. Something had shifted behind his eyes. Something old and terrible was waking up. 3 days later, at 2 in the morning, the south stable erupted in flame. Drummond did not send a message this time. The fire spoke for him. The blaze lit up the sky bright enough that Eliza could see it from Hackberry Valley 4 miles away. She ran outside, looked at the red glow painting the southern horizon, and for the first time since Thomas died, she ran toward the danger instead of away from it. She saddled the ranch horse that Nathaniel had left for her use and rode 4 miles through darkness, with the orange glow growing brighter with every minute. By the time she reached the main ranch, the south stable was fully engulfed. Flames roared 30 feet into the night sky, turning the snowfields orange and throwing wild shadows across the compound. The ranch hands were fighting the fire with everything they had. Bucket lines from the water trough, wet blankets thrown over the nearest structures to stop the spread, axes chopping at the stable walls to free the 6 horses screaming inside. The heat was enormous. Even 50 yards away, Eliza could feel it pressing against her face like a physical force. Nathaniel was inside the stable. She could see him through the burning doorway, his silhouette black against the flames, trying to cut a horse free from its tie line. Jack was shouting from outside, his voice barely audible over the roar. The roof was going. Embers the size of fists were falling from the crossbeams. And then, with a sound like the world cracking in half, a burning timber collapsed across the center of the stable, blocking the doorway and cutting Nathaniel off from the exit. Tommy Redfield did not think. He did not calculate. He did not ask permission. The 19-year-old kid whose shoulder Eliza had reset 3 weeks ago grabbed a wet blanket, wrapped it around his head and shoulders, and ran into the burning building. He found Nathaniel pinned against the back wall by smoke and heat. His left arm burned through the coat sleeve, coughing so hard he could barely stand. Tommy grabbed him by the coat and dragged, through the smoke, through the flames, over the fallen timber that singed Tommy's hands raw through the wet blanket, out into the cold night air where they both collapsed on the frozen ground and lay gasping. The circle completed. Eliza had saved Tommy. Tommy saved Nathaniel. Eliza reached them seconds later. She dropped to the ground beside Nathaniel, tore cloth from her own skirt, and wrapped his burned arm with hands that would not stop shaking. Not from medical uncertainty. She had dressed worse wounds in worse conditions. The shaking came from somewhere deeper, from the place where a woman who had already lost one man she cared about was confronting the possibility of losing another. "He is all right," Jack said from beside her. His voice was gentle in a way she had never heard from him before. "He is all right, Eliza." She did not stop. She wrapped the burn, checked his breathing, pressed her fingers against his neck to feel his pulse. Only when she was satisfied that he was alive and whole, and not going to die in the next 5 minutes, did she sit back on her heels and let herself breathe. Around them, the hands had managed to free the horses and beat back the worst of the fire. The south stable was a total loss, but the main barn and the bunkhouse were saved. Tommy sat nearby, his hands wrapped in rags, grinning through the pain with the particular recklessness of a young man who has just discovered that he is braver than he thought. The fire burned to embers. The hands drifted off to sleep in shifts. Jack kept watch from the barn roof with his rifle, his eyes scanning the dark perimeter for any sign that whoever set the fire was still nearby. And Nathaniel and Eliza sat together against the water trough, side by side, shoulders touching, staring at the glowing ruins. His burned arm was wrapped in her bandages. The night smelled like ash and cold earth, and the particular acrid sweetness of destruction. In the strange, raw honesty that comes after surviving disaster together, the walls fell. Nathaniel spoke first. His voice was hoarse from smoke and something else. "My father did not die of illness." Eliza said nothing. She waited. "He killed himself. Hanged himself in the barn. I came home from the army and found him. I cut him down with my belt knife. I cleaned the barn, burned the rope, told everyone it was fever. Built everything I own on top of that lie, on the belief that he was weak and I would never be." The words came out rough and halting, dragged from a place so deep inside him that bringing them to the surface physically hurt. 12 years of silence breaking like a dam. He gambled, Nathaniel continued, drank, lost everything. The ranch was bankrupt when I took it over. I spent 2 years eating 1 meal a day and working 18 hours straight to dig out of the hole he left. And I told myself every single day that he was weak, that he gave up, that I was different, because I would never lose control the way he did. The fire popped. Embers drifted upward like orange stars. Eliza's turn. Equal exchange, the only currency she respected. "I was carrying Thomas's child when he died," she said quietly. The words sat in the cold air between them. 5 months. I lost the baby in December. Alone. On the cabin floor. In the cold. She stared at the embers. "I buried her under the apple tree Thomas planted our first spring together. I do not even know if it was a girl. I just decided she was. I named her in my head. I never said it out loud." Nathaniel's voice was barely a whisper. "What was the name?" "Rose. After my mother." Two people sitting in the ashes of destruction, handing each other the heaviest things they carried. No romance, no promises. Just the terrifying act of being fully known by another person and trusting them not to use it as a weapon. In the morning, the rawness of the night did not disappear with the sunrise. It settled into something permanent, like a foundation poured and hardened. Eliza showed Nathaniel the recovered text from Thomas's letter. He knew about Father Cross. Thomas knew something about Drummond's connection to your father. Nathaniel stared at the words. "What connection?" "My father's debts were from gambling. He did it to himself." Did he? Or did someone help him into it? The truth assembled itself from fragments they both already held. Drummond buying debts from small farmers. Thomas's letter. Drummond's comment in town weeks ago. Your father was a good man. Shame he did not have the head for business. The years-long campaign for water rights. Amos Cross's sudden descent into gambling and ruin. The picture formed with the terrible clarity of a photograph developing in chemical solution. Drummond had not just bought Amos Cross's debts, he had created them, lured Amos into gambling through intermediaries, rigged the games, bought the debts, squeezed until the man broke, and systematically destroyed Nathaniel's father the same way he would later destroy Thomas Moore, the same way he was trying to destroy Nathaniel now. Different methods, same predator, same patient, merciless strategy. Nathaniel's father was not weak. He was hunted. Everything Nathaniel had believed about his father for 12 years, everything he had believed about himself, collapsed. He stood so fast the water trough rocked, overturned the bench they had been sitting on, headed for the barn where his horse was saddled. Jack stepped into his path. If you ride to Drummond's place right now, you will kill him or he will kill you. Either way, he wins. He destroyed my father, and if you get yourself shot, he will have destroyed the sun too. That is a clean sweep, Nate. Is that what you want? Eliza stood in the doorway of the main house, silent, waiting. She did not tell him to calm down, did not tell him what to do. She waited for him to choose. The red drained from his vision slowly, like blood settling, like water clearing. We fight with paper, Eliza said when his eyes found hers. Not bullets. Helena, the Territorial Land Commission. Everything. Thomas's letter, Haywood's files, the cattle records, the arson. Drummond loses in a courtroom, not in a gunfight. And if the courtroom fails, then we figure out the next thing. Together. That word. Together. It landed in his chest and stayed there, warm and solid and terrifying in its implications. Jack pulled him aside later. There was something about the third rider in the canyon, Jack said. You described his jaw. Sharp, angular, young. I remember. His name is William Pine. His father was Gabriel Pine. I killed Gabriel during a pursuit outside Abilene in '73. Accident. He was running from the gunfire, not toward it. But dead is dead. And his son grew up knowing my face. You recognized him from my description. Jack nodded. Drummond found him. Drummond finds everyone who has a reason to hate. That is his talent. He turns other people's pain into his own weapon. The revelation added one more layer to the picture of Silas Drummond. Not just a land grabber, not just a white-collar predator, a man who collected wounded people the way other men collected horses and aimed them at his enemies with the cold precision of a marksman. That night, Nathaniel stood in front of the charred ruins of his south stable. Eliza stood beside him. They did not touch, did not speak, just two silhouettes against the dying glow, facing the same direction. When he finally turned to her, he did not say thank you, did not say I need you. He said the only words that mattered. Helena. Together. And Eliza nodded. The morning they left for Helena, before dawn, before the train, before any of it, Nathaniel took Eliza to the ridge where his father was buried. The stone marker sat beneath the lone pine, exactly as it had for 12 years, small, weathered, the name barely legible, Amos Cross. No dates, no inscription. Nathaniel had been too angry when he set the stone to add anything more. He stood in front of it now and felt something he had not felt here before. Not anger, not shame. Something quieter and more complicated. Something that might have been the beginning of forgiveness. He was a good man before Drummond got to him, Nathaniel said. He sang while he worked. He taught me to ride by letting me fall off and helping me back up. He laughed at bad weather and worse jokes, and he believed this land would make us rich if we just worked hard enough. Eliza stood beside him, not touching, not speaking, present. I spent 12 years being ashamed of him. I should have been angry at the right person instead. Eliza bent down and placed a small stone on top of the grave marker, a tradition she had learned at army posts, where proper flowers were scarce, and stones lasted longer than anything that bloomed. Neither of them spoke, but something had. Neither of them spoke, but something had changed between them. Some debt to the past had been acknowledged, if not paid. And the man who mounted his horse and rode toward the Livingston train station was not quite the same man who had ridden down into Hackberry Valley 3 months ago to confront a trespasser. The train to Helena took 6 hours, first-class car, nearly empty. The mountains of Montana scrolled past the windows like a painting being slowly unrolled, white peaks against a blue sky, the valleys showing the first green of spring beneath the retreating snow. Eliza read through her testimony notes for the 3rd time. Nathaniel watched the landscape and thought about his father and Thomas Moore, and how many other lives Drummond had broken that neither of them would ever know about. "What are you thinking about?" Eliza asked without looking up from her notes. "Everything. Nothing useful." "You." She looked up at that. "Me. Whether you are ready for this. Whether the commission will actually listen. Whether we are walking into something we cannot win." Eliza set her notes down. She reached across the space between their seats and placed her hand over his on the armrest. A deliberate act, not accidental. She watched his face as she did it, giving him the chance to pull away. He did not pull away. He turned his hand over, palm up, and her fingers settled into his, calloused against calloused, working hands, survivor's hands. They looked at each other and the distance they had maintained for 3 months, professional, careful, strategic, the walls and boundaries and carefully negotiated territories, all of it simply ceased to exist. The kiss was not dramatic. It was slow, tentative, and tasted like coffee and wood smoke, and the particular courage of 2 people who had lost everything and were choosing to risk again anyway. They separated not from awkwardness, but from wanting to see each other clearly now that the last wall between them had fallen. "I am not good at this," Nathaniel said. "Neither am I. But I fixed a collapsed roof with hand tools, and you rebuilt a bankrupt ranch from nothing. I think we can figure this out." Helena was a real city, territorial capital, brick buildings and paved streets and more people in one block than lived in all of Elk Crossing. The Territorial Land Commission occupied a wood-paneled hearing room in the government building on Last Chance Gulch. 3 commissioners sat behind a raised bench. A territorial prosecutor assigned to the case reviewed the evidence with the careful attention of a man who recognized that this was not just one case, but possibly the thread that would unravel a much larger pattern. Eliza testified, not Nathaniel. Eliza. She stood before the commission in the blue wool dress she had mended for the occasion and presented the evidence in her own voice. Thomas's letter, Haywood's case file, the deed transfer that was deliberately sabotaged, the recovered text naming Drummond as the orchestrator. She spoke clearly, precisely, without tears or performance. When the head commissioner asked how she felt about losing her property, Eliza looked him in the eye and said, "My feelings are not evidence, sir. The documents are. I am asking you to look at the paper, not at me." The room went still. Then Marcus Haywood entered the chamber. Not as a defendant, as a witness. Drummond, anticipating that the investigation might reach territorial level, had already begun preparing to make Haywood the sole scapegoat. Haywood had received word through intermediaries that Drummond intended to deny everything and let the lawyer take the full weight of the consequences. Facing the choice between absorbing all the blame alone or telling the truth, Haywood chose the option that gave him the slightest chance of survival. His testimony was devastating. He named Drummond as the architect of the conspiracy, confirmed that Thomas Moore's deed transfer was deliberately suppressed on Drummond's orders, detailed how Drummond had purchased Amos Cross's debts through intermediaries and driven the man to ruin, named the Bozeman Justice of the Peace as a paid collaborator, provided dates, amounts, and the names of other families whose cases had been similarly sabotaged. The commissioner's expressions hardened with each revelation. The clerk's pen scratched furiously across the record. Nathaniel sat in the gallery and listened to his father's destroyer named aloud in a court of law for the first time. 12 years of shame and anger and misdirected grief found their proper target. His jaw was tight. His eyes were bright. He did not speak. He did not need to. He did. Catharsis does not always require words. Sometimes it just requires the truth spoken in a room where it matters. The commission's ruling came that afternoon. Eliza Moore's property, 40 acres outside Bozeman, to be restored to her name pending full review of the original transfer. Marcus Haywood's law license permanently revoked. Haywood to be remanded to the custody of the Gallatin County Sheriff for detention at the county jail pending formal charges of fraud and conspiracy to deprive citizens of property. Silas Drummond's assets frozen territory-wide, pending criminal investigation. All property transfers involving Haywood or Drummond associates within the past 5 years to be reviewed by the Commission. Territorial warrants issued for Drummond's arrest on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and destruction of property. But justice on the frontier was never clean. A telegram arrived at the Commission before the hearing adjourned. Drummond's ranch was empty. His hired men were gone. His personal safe had been cleaned out. Silas Drummond had fled the territory, crossed into Wyoming or Idaho. No one was certain. A territorial warrant would follow him to every state and territory in the West. But the frontier was vast, and a man with cash could disappear into it like smoke into a mountain sky. Nathaniel took the news hard. He stood in the hallway outside the hearing room with his hat in his hands and his jaw set. "He is gone," he said. "After everything. He just runs." Eliza stood beside him. She took his hand. He lost his land, his reputation, his network. The warrant follows him everywhere. Haywood is in the county jail and singing like a bird. The other families will get their cases reviewed. The machine Drummond built is broken. That is not justice. No, it is reality. Justice on the frontier was never going to be perfect, Nathaniel, but his machine is broken, and we are still standing. She squeezed his hand. We did not fight for a perfect ending. We fought for the truth. The truth is on the record now. No one can bury it again. They took the train back to Livingston that evening. The mountains were pink and gold in the setting sun, and the valleys were greening with the first real warmth of spring. The snow was retreating up the slopes like a tide going out, revealing the brown and green earth beneath. They did not talk much on the ride back. They did not need to. Something had been completed between them that words could not improve. They sat side by side with their hands linked and watched the landscape that had shaped them both scroll past the windows. And the silence between them was the silence of two people who have survived the worst and come out the other side and discovered that the other side is not empty. It is full of possibility. Spring came to Montana in earnest. The creek in Hackberry Valley ran full and clear, fed by snowmelt from the high peaks, the meadow greened. And on a warm morning in late April, the first wildflowers pushed up through the soil, yellow and purple and white, covering the valley floor like a promise kept. Eliza received the restored deed to Thomas's land by courier from Helena. She held the document in both hands, read her name on it, and stood for a long time looking at it. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in her trunk. She did not go back to Bozeman. She did not reclaim the land in person. "Those 40 acres are my past," she told Nathaniel. "I will sell them and put the money into the workshop here. This valley is my future." Nathaniel rode up to the ridge one more time, to his father's grave. The lone pine was budding, new growth. He sat beside the stone marker and stayed for a long time. He talked quietly. We could not hear the words if we were standing 10 feet away. Private words, the kind a son says to a father when he finally understands what happened and is ready to stop being angry at the wrong person. When he stood, he looked different. Not lighter, exactly, but like a man who has finally set down a weight he did not know he was allowed to put down. The final scene in this story is the simplest one. Nathaniel rode down the trail into Hackberry Valley. Not to inspect, not to manage, not because his ledgers required it, because he wanted to be there. Eliza was in the garden she had cleared months ago, kneeling in the dirt, planting seeds with her hands black to the wrists with rich Montana soil. Tommy Redfield and 2 young ranch hands were working on the cabin expansion nearby, the sound of saws and hammers and laughter carrying across the meadow in the warm spring air. The Winchester hung on a peg inside the cabin door, not in anyone's hands, not needed. Eliza looked up when she heard his horse. She did not stop working. She just smiled, small, real, private. Not a smile meant for an audience, a smile meant for him. Nathaniel dismounted, took off his coat, reached for a hoe leaning against the cabin wall, started breaking earth beside her. "You do not have to do this," Eliza said. "I know, but I want to." 3 words, "I want to." From a man who had only ever known "I need to" and "I require." From a man who had built an empire on control and obligation and the absolute certainty that wanting things was a weakness he could not afford. Those 3 words were worth more than any declaration of love or any promise of forever. Then a gunshot echoed from behind the barn. Tommy and the hands were doing target practice, the crack of rifles sharp and clean in the spring air. Nathaniel's hand went to his hip by reflex, and found nothing. He was not wearing his gun. First time he had come down to this valley without a weapon on his belt. He looked at Eliza. She looked at his empty holster, then at him. And they both understood. He did not need it here anymore. This was home, spring of 1881. Smoke still rose from the chimney in Hackberry Valley, but now it carried the smell of coffee brewed for 2 instead of 1. Nathaniel Cross had built his empire on one iron rule. Nothing existed on his land without his permission. He had been wrong. The best thing he ever had never asked permission. She just arrived, took root, and taught him that sometimes letting go of control is not losing, it is finding.